My name is Vishal Ahuja, by the way. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And we're talking about adaptive clinical trials. As you can see, this is focused on healthcare. And the innovation comes from the fact that we learn simultaneously from all the patients. And you'll get a better idea as we proceed along. And this is joint work with Professor John Burgess, as Michael already pointed out. So I don't have any slides to show about what Chicago Booth is or what it does. You can go to chicagobooth.edu to look about it. So let me begin by this talk by giving you a bit of motivation about this work. And you'll see that this work, although a bit of theory comes from it, but it can have a potential impact. And you'll see an example of that and towards the end of this talk. But motivation comes from the fact that if you look at the recent media headlines, they talk about the rising costs of bringing new drugs to market. These are just a selected few. This article by Forbes came out just right after Super Bowl, for example, where they talk about this commercial by Eli Lilly that cost them $1.3 billion. And to put this in perspective, what they said was, well, this kind of money could buy, 2 football stadiums in America, 371 such Super Bowl ads, or 6 consecutive weeks worth of tickets for every single football stadium in the nation. Time puts this number at about $1 billion. This Trade magazine puts this number at about $2 billion. Pretty high. And because clinical trials constitute a good, I'd say $100 million worth of estimate in terms of developing drugs, the goal of our work was to figure out a design that would produce conclusive results in a shorter period and with fewer patients, and as you'll see in a second, one that's actually implementable, not the ones that just exist in literature today. All right, so a bit of outline as to what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a little about what the drug process looks like and the role of clinical trials. What is the existing design today that most clinical trials use and what are its advantages and where they lack, essentially. The kind of adaptive designs that exist in literature today and why they can't be implemented or why they wouldn't produce good results. And the one that we propose today, I'll show you some numerical results in terms of some advantages that our design can provide. And finally, this is what I was talking about earlier, show you an application to a real clinical trial, gives you a sense of the kind of impact that we could have. All right, so this is sort of like a general overview of how a drug development process works. You start with about 10,000 compounds on average, leads to about 1 FDA-approved drug. It's like a filtering process, they call it. And we're focusing on clinical trials here, which are typically conducted in phase 1, 2, and 3, typically to test a drug's safety, its effectiveness, and its effectiveness with respect to existing therapies. And the key thing is the development of the protocol. What a protocol says is how a trial would be conducted, among other things. And that needs to be approved by an independent review board before a trial can begin. And any changes are not allowed unless you want to go back to the independent review board. And because such a long time to develop, actually the cancer drugs take about 8 years on average, companies really are afraid to kind of go back and do that changes later on. We're focusing on phase 3 primarily because they constitute 90% of total clinical trial costs, coming from 2 sources. Of course, there's a cost to recruit the patients, pegged at about $47,000 today, and the time opportunity cost. So give you some real context. Most of you have heard of this drug called Lipitor, the largest selling drug that Pfizer manufactures. The patent expired last December. So I looked at the monthly sales, the average monthly sales in the quarter before the drug expired and the quarter after it expired. These are monthly sales. Look at the massive difference, about $333 million. So anything we could do to shave off some time from the development costs, we could reduce, a month reduction could be up to $500 million. So
the patent is obtained before?
Before, actually. So, even they don't, exactly, yeah. All right, so what is the fixed randomized design? And I use the word fixed it's commonly called randomized, but as I said, the word fixed really means that to distinguish it from other designs that potentially use some form of randomization. So when the trial begins, patients come in and you typically allocate them at random, and that's fine. But suppose you learn from the patients, you're not allowed to reallocate subsequent patients unless the protocol is specifically asked to do so. And new patients may enter the trial, and the existing patients may leave the trial, simply drop out. And that's actually another problem. And the primary objective of such a trial or such a design is to conclusively determine whether one treatment is better than the other. It has some advantages. It's very well understood. It's been in use for several decades now. It's a clean way to separate treatments, so let's say two interventions, A and B, and may probably be the only way to do the trial if the responses from patients cannot be observed until the very end. The biggest drawback is that it does not use responses that are observed from patients earlier on in the trial to make any allocations later on, which could cause, amongst many things, poor patient health, longer trial, results that are inconclusive, and so forth. So I want to give you some examples of two real trials that have used fixed randomized design of late and have caused a bit of controversy. The first is this trial called Stenting and Aggressive Medical Management for Preventing Recurrent Stroke and Intracranial Stenosis. A mouthful, so it's SAMMPRIS for short. So doctors have been thinking about using stents for treating narrowing of brain artery for a while, just like stents are used in heart arteries. And the typical or the existing intervention is basically give medications to treat that disease. As I said, the new treatment is where they want to add stent or insert a stent along with the medications. And basically what they thought was that if we give the intervention and we'll consider it a failure or that the intervention didn't work, if they did observe a stroke or a death within 30 days of giving intervention. To give you some background, there was a trial conducted in 2005 on a 45-patient single-arm trial using stents alone. And what they found was that actually was a pretty successful trial, resulted in 4.4% failure rate. And the existing treatment, which is using medications alone, it's a pretty standard treatment, so they know the failure rate kind of been established. So the FDA approved that stent to be used in the next trial. And so that trial, the SAMMPRIS trial in particular, enrolled a much larger set of patients, 451, that used two treatments, existing and new, where about 3 to 4 patients were enrolled on a weekly basis for about 2.5 years. And of course, they employed the fixed randomized design. And what the result was that the failure rate was 10.2%. In particular, the stent one was 14.7%, quite contrary to this number that they thought would be closer to. Actually resulted in a major controversy, for example, highlighted by this New York Times article. I want you to wait until the end of the talk where we'll tell you what we did on that. But before that, let me talk about another trial, which we're thinking of doing some sort of analysis, is the CATIE trial, short for Clinical Antipsychotic Trial of Intervention Effectiveness. So the goal of this trial that completed about 6 or 7 years ago, and actually it serves one of the motivation for this work. We've been talking to some of our collaborators who are physicians at the University of Chicago Medical School. They were kind of worried about this trial because one of the collaborators actually is a part of that study. And the study tried to compare older versus newer schizophrenic drugs in terms of their effectiveness. And what the trial did was to enroll about 1,500 patients, cost about $43 million, 18 months, multiple sites, so a major trial. This was actually conducted by the government, actually. What they found was that they couldn't tell anything, really, because 3/4 of the patients dropped out. So the differences in the two randomized design is, that's what I want to highlight, was different patients every period versus same patients that were randomized every period. The failure, what they found was the patient health was bad. Here they found that they couldn't tell anything about the trial. And we'll tell you the results from the SAMMPRIS trial towards the end, but as I said, we're looking at doing some analysis with CATIE as well. All right, so how do adaptive designs differ, and what's the key thing behind adaptive design? Like the randomized design, the adaptive design allocates patients earlier on to interventions at random. Fine. But what it does and what distinguishes it from the randomized design is that it learns from the earlier patient outcomes to subsequently modify allocations if needed based on learning. and new patients may enter and the existing patients may leave the trial. The key feature is its flexibility and its ability to adapt to individual patient responses. It balances the trade-off between learning about those treatments and using that learning to maximize patient health. So we're not building this in vacuum. There have been adaptive designs that have been proposed, mostly in the literature, but they consider a single, or they assume you learn from a single patient observation every period. And our proposed design does better. But before I show you a proposed design, let me give you a visual illustration of what I mean. Suppose there are T time periods where a period could be anything as long as you make decision in that period. Could be a week, could be a month, depending on the trial. But you get to make those allocation decisions at that time period. There's a set of patient observations every period. It could be from the same patients or a different set of patients every period, or a mix of two. So what a fixed randomized design would do is just cleanly separate. Basically, you allocate patients at random at each time period, just like shown here. Existing adaptive design would look something like this, where you learn from the first patient observation, because you only learn from one observation, where you modify allocation for subsequent patient observations. This is great, except that most of us know that a clinical trial consists of multiple patients every time period, most of whom need to be allocated simultaneously. And even if there was a way to allocate them individually, let's say you have 500 patients and a time period is a month, this trial would take you about 500 months. I think a pretty long time for any clinical trial, as you might know. And we call it a perfectly adaptive because it's a perfect way to learn from those treatments or from those observations. A possible allocation mechanism might look like this. However, it doesn't mean that you can't apply the existing adaptive design on a trial with multiple patients at the same time period. You just do it on an isolated basis, where you just learn from one patient observation, but kind of separate them out. We call it isolated adaptive, and one such allocation might look like this. But as most of you may have guessed, we could do better by learning from all those patients simultaneously, and this is exactly what our design, jointly adaptive, does. Possible allocation might look like this. To summarize, there's a fixed randomized, two versions of the adaptive designs, and then a proposed jointly adaptive design. And a key result in our paper really says that perfectly adaptive design works better than jointly adaptive, which works better than isolated. And this is using two objective functions we call maximizing patient health and learning about the treatments for both those objective functions. And essentially, a consequent result is that for a trial that consists of two interventions and 3 periods, it's always better if you allocate patients to multiple interventions the first period. Basically, our design allows for a natural mixing of those interventions. One of the criticisms sometimes levied at the adaptive design, at least the ones that exist today. I'm not going to talk a whole lot, but essentially I want to highlight this guy, Don Berry, not because he's done a lot of work in this field, which he has, dates back to 78, but his work, so there's this trial called I-SPY 2 on breast cancer. That's the only instance I know of where an existing adaptive design has been used. And Barry actually leads that trial. But again, he's using only one patient. Actually, he's just working with like one patient individually and just look at their biomarkers and whatnot. I don't know the whole details, but you can, I'm sure, Google it and you can find I-SPY 2. All right, so a little bit about, this is where the math part comes in. The formulation is a multi-ion bandit, where essentially the key is exploitation versus exploration, learning versus maximizing or exploiting that learning. And the setup, if some of you might know, is a Bayesian adaptive Markov decision process, where the Bayesian setup really is a different mindset, is a different paradigm of thinking, conducting clinical trials. And it's different than the classical frequentist setup, where you use your classical test of hypotheses, p-values, etc. Here in the Bayesian setup, you have to start with some prior beliefs about the treatment, how treatment might work, and then update those beliefs as we move along. We need to know how many patients there are, the number of periods, the number of interventions and outcomes. For example, if there are 2 periods and 2 outcomes, success and failure, we have 4 treatment outcome combinations, what we call a health condition. Basically, your state is a physical health state and an information state. Information state captures the history, where this is just talks about how many patients in each period. Your decision is basically what it boils down to is the number of patients you'll allocate to each intervention. Your rewards depend on the objective chosen. As I said, we consider two different objective functions. Probabilities follow a conjugate prior set of probabilities where we have a Dirichlet conjugate prior and a multinomial likelihood, resulting in a Dirichlet posterior. And finally, we solve a Bellman equation to get our optimal solution. All right. Huh? It's a finite horizon, correct. So yeah.
Horizon in terms of number of trials?
Number of periods, yeah. So here's a summary of the design before I show you the numerical results. There's the fixed randomized, the two versions of the adaptive design, and then a proposed jointly adaptive design. All right. So what we did was we kept it simple to illustrate some of the results, and partly for a reason I'll talk about in a second. But suppose there are two interventions and two outcomes, which covers a good amount of trials that are conducted today. And what we did was compare under multiple scenarios that vary in the number of patients, time periods, and prior beliefs about the outcome probabilities or the success probabilities of each intervention. And what we did was the first objective was to see how the health outcomes in terms of the expected proportion of successes in the trial. Now, people have argued this in the literature. Well, what if my goal is just to maximize learning? Wouldn't the randomized design be the best way to learn? And the answer is no, because what we did was we compared under a second objective, which is captured in the expected confidence in finding the most efficacious treatment at the end of the trial. And we'll show you in a second that our design actually would do better than a fixed randomized design as well. All right, so this kind of captures on the results in the first objective. We took 4 patients and uniform priors, and by uniform priors I mean is that at the beginning of the trial, the beliefs about the success probability are a half, which means I have an equal chance of a success or a failure with each intervention. On the y-axis is the expected number of successes, an absolute number, and on the x-axis is the number of patient observations. If you take any bar, the light brown is the result or the expected number of successes from deploying a fixed randomize. The dark brown is the result from an isolated adaptive, the added number of successes. The light gray is the added number of successes because of the our jointly adaptive, and then finally a thin black sliver is because the additive success is because of the perfectly adaptive. So as you can see, the improvement is increasing the number of patient observations, and between jointly and fixed randomized, we found that jointly adaptive design could really provide an improvement of up to 30%, at least under the scenarios we considered. Between jointly and adaptive, so this is kind of a little bit of theoretical exercise, we find that the improvement is increasing in number of patients, which makes sense because the more the patients, the more the opportunities to learn about the treatments, and is decreasing the number of periods, which might sound counterintuitive, but really what it means is because the bulk of the learning happens on earlier in the trial, additional time periods provide diminished opportunity to learn about the trial, and we found the improvement to be about up to 8.64%. At least in the scenarios we considered. And this is where I was talking about for learning objective. The light brown, again, is the randomized, and the dark brown is the jointly adaptive. So the improvement is small and maybe actually decreasing in time, but really don't do worse compared to the randomized, even if our goal is just to learn about the treatments. This is exactly what I just said. All right, so the key implication and the managerial insight and what it means to the clinicians and the physicians and the practices is, first to summarize, compared to the fixed randomized and the isolated adaptive design, our design, given the number of patients and period, yields higher patient health and learning about the treatments in expectation. But if you flip this on its head, for a given level of patient health or learning, our design and expectation uses fewer periods and patients. And if you go back to one of my earlier slides about the rising cost of bringing drugs to the market, coming from per patient and the time opportunity cost, we could conduct a trial at a lower cost, or pharmaceutical companies could do at a lower, which just not helps them, their bottom line, but helps them bring new drugs to the market, so bring consumer welfare, or increases consumer welfare. Basically do good to the consumers at the end. All right, so I promise I'll show you the results from implementing it on a real trial. So this, if you remember, is a stent trial where they tested stents plus medications versus only medications. where they found the failure rate from the trial to be quite opposite to what they had found from an earlier trial. And the question we wanted to answer was, could we reduce the number of failures had we employed the jointly adaptive or the adaptive design? So what we did was, suppose as a clinician, when I started the trial, I take 4.4% and 5.73%, and instead of running a fixed randomized design, I employed the jointly adaptive design. But then I calculated my failures using the observed 14.7%. I'm not changing this failure rate, but just the way I reallocate patients using my observed prior information. And really, I see a substantial difference: 46 failures, which is deaths or strokes, to just about 29. So 17 potential lives saved, essentially. I mean, to me, it's pretty, impactful, I believe. Anyways, in terms of future work, we're trying to, incorporate not just a few patients, but multiple patients, and not just success failure, but a range of outcomes. And finally, as I was saying, we're trying to work on another trial, Katie, as I was on schizophrenia. And finally, we're actually talking to some doctors about, not doing an ex post analysis, but actually having physicians use our design to actually conduct a clinical trial. We're still thinking about it. All right, so I thought if you weren't convinced, hopefully this will be enough to convince you.